always an honor to be a judge for the Hillman, because those of us journalists who work on the prize committee, well, I'll just speak for myself. I can become focused on the particular injustice that I investigate. And one of the privileges of being a Hillman judge is you get exposed to all sorts of other injustices and get to see how interrelated they are with your own. That was the case with Azmat Khan and Anand Gopal, which is just a tremendous story. Those of us who work in the kind of areas that the Hillman honors, that is, the range of injustices that we see in this country and around the world, have two challenges. The first is to name the particular injustice in the best way possible, and the second is to illuminate it. It's one thing to say war is bad. It's another thing to, as Azmat and Anand did, to actually go into a war zone, or what was formerly a war zone, and count the number of people who had been killed by coalition airstrikes, which is what this story actually did. And lo and behold, what they revealed was that, in fact, the count was actually 31 times higher than what the official count was by the U.S. coalition. Two things I want to say about this. Just as a journalist, the practice of this story, the sheer amount of shoe leather, as we call it, in the world of journalism that was put down by these people is just incredible. To recount, they visited over 150 sites in northern Iraq, interviewed witnesses and survivors, dug through rubble, used satellite imagery to reach the conclusions of how massive this actually was. The second is a point about principle. We live in this age where war is distant from us. We view war through imagery that's given to us through our feed, and we don't quite always reckon with the toll of what's actually happened. And I think one of the great achievements of the encounter, if not the great achievement, is just to see how much misery our own policies are inflicting on the rest of the world. When you read about the story of Basim Razo, who is the principal character in this story, and how he had the kind of middle-class, quote-unquote, bourgeois comforts that most of us in this room have, and how he lost it all in an instant, and how our own government that represents us refused to acknowledge that tragedy and refused to acknowledge so many other tragedies. You just get some sense, I know I get some sense as an American citizen, of how responsible we are for some of the great evil that happens across the globe. Azmat and Anand, I want to salute you guys as journalists. I want to tell you that the highest compliment I can give this story is that it made me tremendously jealous as a journalist. Congratulations.
This is such an honor for both Anand and myself, and that's because we know what the Sidney Hillman Foundation stands for, the values it represents. In fact, few people know it, but Anand actually was a union organizer for years. So this is an honor, but it's also surreal. It's surreal because while Anand and I are being honored here tonight for this work, so many of those whom we relied on, so many of those to whom we are indebted, who told us about the worst nights of their lives so that we could make this story and this investigation possible, have not been recognized as a result. I think especially about the Jassim family in East Mosul, who lost 8 children in a single airstrike, one of whom was only 2 days old. And how when I went back to visit them recently in Iraq after the story had been published, they had yet to hear from the United States, they had yet to hear from the coalition, and they had yet to get medical care. One of the women showed me x-rays that had been taken on a cell phone because they couldn't afford proper medical care. I think of Basim Razo, who lost his wife, his daughter, his brother, and his nephew in a US airstrike, and then set out on a quest for justice. I think about how a little over a week ago, he arrived in New York, and Basim wanted to go to the 9/11 memorial. And so we went, and as we walked through exhibits, past pieces of rubble mounted on pedestals, walls plastered with photos of loved ones, tributes, birthday cards, flowers, and the sound of answering machine goodbyes, Bassem told me that he was struck by the loss and sadness, but also by the fact that all of that was to commemorate a single day, and that so many Iraqis, over more than a decade, have had many of those days. He was struck by that, and when we entered an atrium where we found a quote that said, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time," he wondered if Iraqis would have that same commemoration. We should say the same of Iraqis. Their names are not etched in marble. The rubble from their homes is not encased by velvet rope. They often go unnamed and uncounted. But even if we here in America do not know their losses, they will never forget them. In the 2 years that Anand and I spent reporting this story, I was constantly gripped in learning the extents to which people would go to seek restitution on behalf of their loved ones. I met a family from Ramadi who were so desperate to prove that their relatives had been killed in an airstrike that they actually snuck back into ISIS territory and dug up their bodies. For so many Iraqis, commemoration itself becomes an act of justice. For Anand and me, it was merely the act of interpreting, of finding their stories. You know, these people are ready to tell them. That job was small. The hard part, honestly, was something that we were privileged to be able to do. We were able to go to the US military and demand answers. They told us no, repeatedly, over and over. They told us, no, you can't come to our airbase. They told us, no, we won't check more than 4 coordinates. But it is a privilege as a journalist to be able to demand that they do more than that. It's something few people are able to push for, and it's why journalists need so much more than ever to not just tell these stories, but to push back on the government when they're not providing you information, when they're not telling the truth, and in this case, when they're leading one of the least transparent wars in modern US history. We want to thank our editors at the New York Times Magazine. There's a very long story about how long it took us to get this published. We want to thank, of course, the Sidney Hillman Foundation. But we also want to thank the hundreds of Iraqis who made this story possible, most of all. They were engaged in an act of justice by telling us their stories, an act of justice not just in the face of a failure of the US military, but our collective failure to recognize the losses of others, to recognize the lives of others. And that's something that we see here in the room tonight is pushing back on that. So many of the honorees tonight, we're just grateful to be among you because the work you do is extraordinary. And we're so grateful for everyone who read this story, everyone who shared it, and we hope that ultimately what can come out of it is not just a greater recognition of these losses, but that something can be done about it. Thank you so much.